Kids ignored my warnings and learned a very expensive lesson. As a kid, my family was too poor to ever decorate on Halloween, so when I finally got my own place, I decided to heal my inner child and go all out for Halloween. I'm talking custom-built animatronics, fog machines, the whole 9 yards. I spent months building props in my garage. I was excited just imagining the looks on kids' faces when they saw it all. But just when I started setting things up, strange things started happening. I'd come out in the morning and find my extension cords unplugged or some of my smaller decorations moved around. I thought maybe it was the wind or an animal. A really smart animal. But then I checked my security camera and there they were. 4 teenagers messing with stuff on my lawn and laughing about it. One of the kids, Jeremy, lived just 3 houses down. I went over there and asked him to kindly stop, but he just looked at me like I was talking gibberish. "Broski, it's just decorations. Can you chill?" His friends chuckled behind him. "Those decorations cost almost $1,000 and 5 months of hard work." He snorted and slammed the door shut on my face. That should have been my first warning about what kind of kid I was dealing with. Instead of unplugging things, they started actually stealing things from my lawn. Small stuff at first, like plastic pumpkins and fake tombstones. I replaced them and added more cameras with signs that read, "Smile for the camera," thinking it would scare them away. It didn't. They waved at the cameras, making faces while they messed with my stuff, tangling up all my light strands, breaking delicate props that I actually couldn't replace. I tried confronting them again, reminding them that the electrical setup was dangerous. But Jeremy just laughed in my face. "What are you gonna do, old man? Call the cops over Halloween decorations? Nobody's scared of the cops anymore. They're canceled." "Well, maybe I'll just tell your parents," I threatened. That was a mistake. They started damaging my actual house instead of just the decorations, spray painting over my cameras and windows, jamming the lock in my front door with chewing gum. They even ripped off one of the legs of my $300 animatronic spider. That's when I realized these kids weren't going to stop. I went through all my security footage, documented every single incident with timestamps. I had their faces clear as day, their voices. I talked to other neighbors to see if they maybe saw anything, only to realize that they were also getting terrorized by Jeremy's group years before I moved in, stealing packages, destroying mailboxes, even throwing toilet paper all over their houses. I printed everything out and sent a certified letter to Jeremy's parents with all the evidence. I included photos of the damage and estimated I was looking at over $1,800 in destroyed property. His parents walked over with the letter and handed it back. "You need to relax. They're just kids, little boys. You should know how they are," they told me. Yeah, sure, I knew how teenage boys are because I was one just a couple of years back. But I wasn't a straight-up menace to society, you know? But I figured if the parents weren't listening, all I could do was make sure the rest of the decorations wouldn't get damaged. I installed new cameras with night vision and motion sensors, but this time I hid them really well. I put up new warning signs. "Danger, high-voltage electrical. Do not touch." And I decided that if they came back one more time and damaged anything else, I'd finally call the police and press charges no matter what. Halloween week came and I had my display at full scale, ready for all the trick-or-treaters. But the night before Halloween, Jeremy and his crew showed up. Not surprising. They hopped my fence, walked past all the warning signs I'd posted, and headed straight for my biggest piece, a 12-foot Reaper I'd spent all summer building. Jeremy climbed up on it while his friends filmed on their phones, trying to ride it like it was a mechanical bull before breaking off the arms. But just as he did, the entire structure ripped over, making Jeremy fall hard onto my decorative fence spikes, which were plastic but still definitely hurt. I actually heard the scream from inside my house and woke up. His friends panicked seeing the lights in my room come on and tried yanking him up. One of them accidentally grabbed onto one of the electrical wiring and got shocked, falling onto their backs. The 2 that weren't injured had to drag them away, leaving behind my broken animatronic, a destroyed section of fence, and Jeremy's phone as evidence. I woke up, saw the damage, reviewed the footage, and called the police. But that was actually the worst thing that could have happened to me, because even though Jeremy had to empty his savings to pay for the damages, he was now out for blood, and this time, it didn't stop with vandalism. I never imagined how far he'd go. The next morning, I pulled out my phone and started taking photos of every single piece of broken decoration, every scratch on my fence, every footprint in the dirt around the Reaper. My hands were still shaking from everything that happened just hours before. The police had taken statements from me and collected Jeremy's phone as evidence, but I knew this was just getting started. I couldn't stop thinking about what the officer said when he was leaving. He mentioned something about how kids like Jeremy don't usually stop after getting caught once, especially when they feel like they got embarrassed. The phrase "out for blood" kept running through my head while I measured the damaged sections and wrote down timestamps from my security footage. I sent everything to my email so I'd have backup copies in case something happened to my computer. 2 days passed without any contact, then my phone rang with an unknown number. It was Detective Hayes, the guy assigned to my case. He wanted to schedule a follow-up interview to go over some additional details and collect more documentation. I felt relieved hearing that there was an actual process happening, like the system was taking this seriously. But then Hayes mentioned that Jeremy's parents had already hired a lawyer, which meant everything would be going through official channels now. That made me worried because I knew lawyers meant delays and complications, and probably a lot more time before anything got resolved. Hayes told me to keep documenting everything and to call him directly if anything else happened. The following week, I got a call from the police department saying Jeremy was required to pay for the damaged animatronic and fence as part of the initial resolution. The amount came to about $800, which Hayes said was probably everything Jeremy had saved up from birthdays and odd jobs. The money didn't come directly from Jeremy, though. His parents brought over a check one afternoon, and Franklin Mahoney stood on my doorstep with this look on his face like he wanted to punch through my door. He didn't say anything, just handed me the check and walked away before I could even thank him. That look told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't over. Paying that money had just made things worse between us. For the next week, everything seemed quiet on the surface. No more vandalism, no more kids jumping my fence at night. But I started noticing Jeremy whenever he walked past my house. He didn't do anything, didn't yell or throw things or even make gestures. He just slowed down and stared at my house for a few seconds before moving on. Somehow that felt way more threatening than all the actual vandalism. It was like he was studying my property, planning something. I started keeping my curtains closed during the day because I couldn't stand the feeling of being watched. My house started feeling like a cave, dark and closed off from the neighborhood. On day 8 after the incident, I was scrolling through social media when I saw a video that made my stomach turn. Someone had posted clips from my security footage, but they were edited to make it look completely different. The videos were cut to show Jeremy climbing on the Reaper and falling, but all the warning signs I posted were edited out. The caption said things like, "Local psycho sets traps for kids," and "Man deliberately creates dangerous Halloween display." The comments were full of local teenagers calling me crazy and saying I wanted to hurt kids on purpose. Some of them were talking about how I should be arrested for setting up booby traps. I took screenshots of everything and sent them to Detective Hayes, but the damage was already done. The videos had hundreds of shares. My insurance company sent someone out to assess all the damage later that week. The adjuster was professional and took a bunch of photos, but then she explained something that made me want to scream. My policy would only cover about 60% of the losses because most of the custom-built items weren't specifically scheduled on my policy. She said I should have gotten them appraised and added to my coverage separately. My deductible was $1,000, which meant even with the $800 from Jeremy, I was still out significant money. All those months of work in my garage, all those custom pieces I built by hand and insurance, was only going to cover a fraction of it. Detective Hayes called me again a few days later with some actually good news. Other neighbors had been coming forward with complaints about Jeremy and his friends going back almost 2 years. Carol, from 2 houses down, shared footage of them stealing packages from her porch last Christmas. Another family had video of the group throwing eggs at their house and breaking their mailbox. Hayes said this pattern of behavior would strengthen my case a lot because it showed Jeremy wasn't just some kid who made one mistake. This was ongoing criminal behavior affecting multiple families. I met with Detective Hayes at the station to talk about filing for a no-contact order against Jeremy. The paperwork required me to document every single incident in detail, which I could do thanks to all my security footage, but the process felt overwhelming. I had to write out dates and times and descriptions of what happened and how it made me feel. Hayes kept assuring me that building a proper paper trail now would matter if things got worse. He said judges take these situations more seriously when there's clear documentation showing escalation. I filled out everything as carefully as I could and submitted the request. Franklin and Reese Clements showed up at my door unannounced on a Saturday morning. I opened the door thinking it might be a delivery, but instead it was Jeremy's parents standing there looking angry. Franklin started going off about how I was trying to criminalize their son over teenage mistakes. Reese jumped in saying I was ruining Jeremy's future over some Halloween decorations that could be replaced. They kept talking about how boys will be boys and how I was being vindictive by involving the police. I kept my anger in check somehow and told them they needed to contact me only through Detective Hayes from now on. Then I closed the door while they were still talking. I could hear them arguing on my porch for another minute before they finally left. 2 nights later, I woke up to this loud hissing sound coming from outside. It took me a second to figure out what it was. Then I realized it was air escaping from something. I ran to my window and saw 2 figures in hoodies running down the street. I checked my security camera and saw them crouched by my car, then running off when they finished whatever they were doing. I went outside and found 2 of my tires completely slashed, flat against the pavement. The camera had caught the figures, but their faces weren't visible under the hoodies. I knew it was Jeremy's group, but without clear identification, it was just more documentation for the growing file Detective Hayes was building. The tow truck didn't arrive until almost 9 in the morning, which meant I had to call work and explain why I'd be late. The driver took one look at the slashed tires and shook his head, saying he'd seen this kind of thing before in neighborhoods with problem kids. He loaded my car onto the flatbed and drove me to the nearest repair shop, where the manager told me I'd need 2 new tires at about $200 each after labor. I sat in their waiting room for 3 hours watching daytime television while they finished the work, my phone buzzing with missed messages from the office. When I finally got to work around 1 in the afternoon, Gabriella pulled me into her office before I even reached my desk. She closed the door and sat down across from me with this concerned look on her face. She mentioned that I'd seemed distracted lately, missing deadlines and showing up late, and she wanted to know if everything was okay at home. I gave her the short version about the harassment and the vandalism and the ongoing police investigation, trying to keep my voice steady. She listened without interrupting, then leaned back in her chair and sighed. She told me she understood that I was dealing with a difficult situation, but I needed to keep my work performance steady because the team was counting on me. I promised I'd do better and got back to my desk, feeling like I was failing at everything. That evening around 6, Carol showed up at my front door carrying a folder full of papers. She'd been talking to other families on the block about forming an actual neighborhood watch, not just casual complaints, but a real organized system. She explained that at least 8 households were fed up with the ongoing harassment from Jeremy's group, and they wanted to coordinate security footage sharing and set up a rotation for keeping eyes on each other's properties. She'd already created a group chat and drafted a schedule for evening patrols, and she wanted to know if I'd join. I agreed immediately, feeling this huge wave of relief that I wasn't facing this alone anymore. She handed me a printed copy of the patrol schedule and told me she'd add my number to the group chat tonight. The following week at work, I started noticing weird looks from some of my coworkers during lunch breaks. One of them, someone I barely knew from accounting, asked me straight out if I was the guy who set up traps to hurt kids on Halloween. I felt my face get hot and asked where she'd heard that. She said her sister went to the same gym as Jeremy's parents, and apparently they'd been telling everyone who'd listen that I deliberately created dangerous conditions to injure children who were just playing around. The story had spread to the local coffee shop too, and now people in the neighborhood were talking about me like I was some kind of monster. I tried explaining what actually happened, how the kids were ignored multiple warning signs and broke into my property to vandalize my stuff, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. By the end of the week, I felt my reputation crumbling faster than I could repair it, and there was nothing I could do to stop the rumors. Late one night around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a motion sensor alert from the garage. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the security feed, watching 2 dark figures trying to pry open the garage door with what looked like a crowbar. I called 911 immediately and kept watching the screen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The figures must have heard something because they suddenly ran off toward the street just as I saw police lights approaching in the distance. 2 officers arrived within 5 minutes and walked around my property with flashlights, finding fresh pry marks on the garage door frame and scratches in the paint. They took photos and filled out another incident report, adding it to the growing file that Detective Hayes was building. One of the officers told me to consider upgrading my locks and maybe installing motion-activated lights around the perimeter. I thanked them and went back inside, but I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I made a decision that felt like admitting defeat. I rented a storage unit across town and spent the entire afternoon loading up my most valuable remaining props and animatronics. The 12-foot Reaper was already destroyed, but I still had the fog machines, the expensive sound system, and several custom pieces I'd built by hand over months of work. I wrapped everything carefully and drove it all to the storage facility, making 3 trips back and forth. When I was done, my garage looked empty and sad, nothing like the creative workshop it had been just weeks ago. I stood there staring at the bare walls and concrete floor, feeling like Jeremy had won. A few days later, Detective Hayes stopped by in the late afternoon. He'd been canvassing the neighborhood and collecting statements from multiple households, and he wanted to update me on what he'd found. At least 6 families had documented incidents involving Jeremy and his friends over the past 2 years, creating a clear pattern that the juvenile system couldn't ignore anymore. One neighbor had video of them throwing rocks at cars, another had footage of them stealing mail, and Carol had that clip of them taking packages from her porch last Christmas. Hayes said this pattern would strengthen my case significantly because it showed Jeremy wasn't just some kid who made one mistake. This was ongoing criminal behavior affecting the whole block. I felt validated hearing this, but I was also angry that it had taken so long for anyone to take real action. Halloween arrived exactly 1 year after I'd started planning my original display. This time, I only put up basic decorations, nothing expensive or elaborate, just some plastic pumpkins and a few strings of orange lights. I sat on my porch with a bowl of candy, watching kids in costumes walk up and down the street with their parents. Some parents thanked me for participating despite everything they'd heard about, and a few kids told me they liked my decorations, even though they were simple. But the joy I'd felt last year planning my elaborate display was completely gone, replaced by this cautious wariness every time someone approached my house. The evening passed without incident, and I packed everything away before midnight, relieved it was over. The day after Halloween, someone posted the doctored security videos again with new commentary. This version had circles drawn around the warning signs in the footage, with text suggesting I'd placed them as legal cover after the fact, not as genuine safety warnings. The post claimed I deliberately created dangerous conditions and then tried to hide behind liability protection. I downloaded everything and sent it to Detective Hayes, my hands shaking with anger. He called me back within an hour and assured me that the timeline of my camera footage proved otherwise, showing I'd installed the signs days before Halloween and that they were clearly visible in multiple angles. He said he'd document this as another form of harassment and add it to the file. My insurance company finally processed the claim in mid-November and sent a check for about $1,200 after the deductible. I stared at the number feeling sick because it covered less than half of my actual losses. So many of the custom pieces weren't specifically itemized on my policy, and the adjuster had valued them at basic replacement cost instead of the time and skill I'd invested. I learned an expensive lesson about proper insurance documentation, but it was too late to help with this situation. I deposited the check and tried not to think about all the hours of work that had been destroyed. I spent the following weekend upgrading my security even further. I installed motion-activated lights around the entire perimeter of my property, bright enough to light up the whole yard if anyone approached. I trimmed back all the bushes that had created blind spots for my cameras, hauling the branches to the curb in heavy bags. Then I called a locksmith and paid him to rekey all my doors because I'd become paranoid about copies of my keys somehow existing. The costs kept adding up, several $100 more on top of everything else, but feeling safer was worth every penny. 2 weeks went by without any new problems, but then a thick envelope from the city showed up in my mailbox. I opened it standing right there on my driveway and felt my stomach drop when I read the header. Someone filed a code compliance complaint against my property, claiming my electrical setup for Halloween decorations created dangerous conditions. The complaint said I was running extension cords wrong and overloading circuits and creating fire hazards. I knew this was garbage because I'd been super careful about following all the electrical codes when I set everything up. I even had permits for the major installations. But now I had to schedule an inspection and take time off work to deal with this, which meant losing money on top of everything else. I called the number on the notice and got an appointment for the following Tuesday, then sent an email to my boss explaining why I needed another morning off. She wasn't happy about it, but approved the request. I spent that whole evening pulling out my permits and installation records, organizing everything into a folder so I could prove my setup was legal. The anger made it hard to sleep that night because I knew exactly who filed this complaint, even though the city wouldn't tell me. Tuesday morning arrived and the code inspector showed up right on time. He was an older guy with a clipboard and a serious expression who introduced himself and got straight to work. I handed him my folder of permits and records, then followed him around my property while he examined every outlet, every connection, every extension cord I'd used. He took photos and made notes, checking voltage loads and testing circuits with some kind of meter. The whole process took over an hour, and I stood there the entire time, watching him work and trying not to look as nervous as I felt. When he finally finished, he closed his clipboard and looked at me with something like sympathy in his eyes. He told me everything was properly installed and permitted, all my electrical work met code requirements, and there were no violations to cite. Then he said something that made me feel both validated and furious at the same time. He said the complaint was clearly someone trying to cause problems for me, probably someone who had a personal issue, and he could tell this was harassment disguised as a safety concern. He couldn't tell me who filed the complaint because that information was protected, but we both knew. He closed the case right there with no violations found and told me to keep my documentation in case someone tried this again. I thanked him and watched him drive away, then went inside and immediately updated Detective Hayes about this new form of harassment. That same week, things got worse. I came home from work on Thursday and found my front door covered in eggs and spray paint. The eggs had dried into a crusty mess that was going to be hard to clean, and someone had tagged the door with the word "Psycho" in bright red paint. But that wasn't even the worst part. I walked around to check the rest of the house and found scorch marks on the siding near my garage where someone had set off a firework. The damage wasn't huge, but the message was crystal clear. They were stepping things up. I grabbed my hose and a scrub brush and started cleaning the egg off my door while my security cameras recorded everything. The spray paint was going to need special cleaner, so I made a note to buy some after I finished with the eggs. I was scrubbing away, my arms getting tired, when I pulled out my phone and emailed the new footage to Detective Hayes before I was even done cleaning. The email said I was documenting another escalation and asked what else I could do to make this stop. He called me back within an hour and told me to save my receipts for the cleaning supplies and the paint I'd need to fix the door. He said every incident was building the case even though it felt painfully slow. The constant problems were destroying my ability to sleep. I'd lie in bed listening to every sound outside, jumping at car doors and wind and anything that might be someone messing with my property. I was exhausted all the time, dragging through my workdays and drinking way too much coffee just to stay functional. My friend Reed Durham noticed how wrecked I looked when we met up for lunch one day and offered to let me crash at his apartment across town for a night. He said I needed to get away from my house and actually rest somewhere I felt safe. I took him up on it that weekend, packing an overnight bag and driving to his place feeling guilty the whole way. His apartment was small but clean and quiet, and most importantly, it was far enough away that I couldn't obsess about my house. We ordered pizza and watched movies until late, and for the first time in weeks, I actually fell asleep without waking up every hour. I slept through the entire night, something that felt almost impossible at this point. But even while I was getting that rest, part of me worried about what might be happening to my house while I wasn't there to watch it. I drove home the next morning feeling more rested than I had in forever, but that feeling disappeared fast. As soon as I pulled into my driveway, I smelled something wrong. It was a faint smoke smell, not fresh but definitely recent, coming from somewhere near my garage. I walked around the side of the house and found a pile of leaves stacked against the garage door with scorch marks running through them. Someone had tried to start a fire. The leaves were burned in places, but the fire hadn't caught properly, probably because the leaves were still a bit damp from recent rain. My hands started shaking as I stared at the evidence. If those leaves had been drier, if the fire had caught and spread to the wooden garage door, my whole garage could have burned down with all my tools and storage inside. Maybe even the house. I pulled out my phone and called Detective Hayes immediately, my voice coming out higher than normal as I explained what I'd found. He told me not to touch anything and said he was sending someone right away. Detective Hayes showed up with a fire department inspector about an hour later. The inspector was a woman with short gray hair who took her job very seriously. She examined the scorch marks in the leaves, took photos from multiple angles, and used some kind of tool to collect samples of the burned material. She asked me questions about when I'd left and when I got back, writing down all the timing information. After she finished documenting everything, she confirmed that the burn pattern matched what you'd see from a firework or similar ignition source. She said someone definitely tried to start a fire here, and it was only luck that it didn't catch. Then she told Detective Hayes that this needed to be classified as attempted arson, which was way more serious than vandalism or property damage. She filled out an official report right there, and Detective Hayes made copies of everything for his case file. I stood there watching them work and feeling sick, thinking about how close I'd come to losing everything. The fire inspector told me to install a fire extinguisher near my garage and to keep the area clear of anything flammable, which I agreed to do immediately. That evening my phone rang and it was Carol. She sounded excited in a weird way, like she had important news. She told me to check my email because she was sending me something from her Ring camera. I opened my laptop and found the video file she'd sent. The footage showed Jeremy walking past my house on the morning when the fire attempt happened. He was carrying something in his hand that looked exactly like a Roman candle firework. Carol had circled the timestamp on the video, and it matched perfectly with the window when the leaves must have been burned based on what I'd told the fire inspector. This was it. Finally, we had clear footage of Jeremy specifically doing something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. I watched the video 3 more times to make sure I was seeing it right, then forwarded it immediately to Detective Hayes with a message saying this was proof Jeremy was the one who tried to burn down my garage. He responded within minutes saying this was exactly what they needed, and he'd be moving forward with formal questioning. Detective Hayes brought Jeremy in for an interview a few days later. I wasn't there, but Hayes called me afterward to fill me in on what happened. Jeremy showed up with both his parents, Franklin and Reese, and they had their lawyer with them. The lawyer did most of the talking while Jeremy sat there looking bored. Hayes showed them Carol's video footage with the timestamp and the clear image of Jeremy holding the firework. He asked Jeremy to explain what he was doing walking past my house at that specific time, carrying that specific item. Jeremy denied everything. He said the video didn't prove anything and that lots of people have fireworks and walk around the neighborhood. His lawyer backed him up, arguing that carrying a firework isn't proof that someone used it to commit arson. They stonewalled every question, refusing to admit anything or explain the suspicious timing. The whole interview ended with nothing accomplished except more documentation. I felt so frustrated when Hayes told me this. We had clear video evidence and it still wasn't enough to get Jeremy to admit what he'd done. The system moved so slowly, grinding through procedures and paperwork while I was stuck dealing with the consequences. But then something changed. A few days after that failed interview, Detective Hayes got a call from Lucas Britt's mother. Lucas was one of the kids who'd been part of Jeremy's group from the beginning. His mom said Lucas wanted to talk, and that she was horrified by what she'd been hearing. Hayes went to their house and Lucas admitted everything off the record. He said Jeremy had been planning revenge ever since he had to pay for the Halloween damages. The fire attempt was deliberate, not an accident. Jeremy had been talking about burning down my garage to teach me a lesson for calling the cops. Lucas's mother sat there during the whole conversation looking shocked and angry. She told Hayes that Lucas would cooperate fully with whatever the investigation needed. This was the first real crack in the group's solidarity. One of them finally broke and told the truth because his parents stepped in and made him do the right thing. Hayes documented everything Lucas said and added it to the growing file of evidence against Jeremy. Based on Lucas's statement and Carol's video footage, Detective Hayes filed paperwork for a temporary no-contact order. He explained that with both the video evidence and a witness statement confirming Jeremy's intent, a judge would likely grant the order. The paperwork went through faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, I got a call from Hayes saying the judge had approved it. Jeremy was now legally prohibited from coming within 100 feet of my property or contacting me in any way. If he violated the order, he'd face immediate arrest and additional charges. I felt actual relief for the first time in months. There were finally real consequences happening. The system was slow and frustrating, but it was working. Jeremy couldn't just walk past my house anymore or mess with my property without facing serious legal problems. I thanked Hayes and hung up, then sat down on my couch and just breathed for a minute. It wasn't over. I knew that. But at least now there was something official protecting me instead of just cameras and documentation. The no-contact order didn't stop Jeremy, it just made him smarter about how he came after me. 2 days later, I opened my front door to find 6 pizzas I never ordered sitting on my porch, all paid for with cash on delivery, according to the receipts stapled to the boxes. The next morning, 3 Chinese food orders showed up at 7 a.m. I called each restaurant to explain I wasn't placing these orders, but they told me someone was using different phones and paying cash in advance, making it impossible to trace. Within a week, I had food deliveries showing up at all hours, packages of random junk sent to my address, and even a tow truck that arrived claiming I'd called for my car to be towed. I documented every single incident with photos and timestamps, creating a spreadsheet that tracked each harassment attempt. Then the social media messages started appearing from accounts with no profile pictures and random letter usernames. The messages never said anything directly threatening, just things like, enjoying your quiet neighborhood, and karma works in mysterious ways and watch your back. I forwarded everything to Detective Hayes with detailed notes about when each message arrived and what platform it came from. He told me to keep documenting, but admitted that proving Jeremy was behind anonymous accounts would be difficult without subpoenaing phone records, which took time and judicial approval. 3 weeks after the no-contact order went into effect, I was home alone on a Thursday evening making dinner when I heard someone rattling the handle on my back door. My whole body went cold and I froze for a second, listening to the sound of someone trying to force the lock. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 while moving quietly toward the front hallway where I kept a baseball bat. The operator answered and I whispered that someone was trying to break into my house through the back door, giving her my address. She told me officers were on the way and to stay on the line, but then I heard the rattling stop and footsteps running across my back deck. I moved to the window and saw 2 figures in dark hoodies jumping my back fence and disappearing into the alley. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the phone, and I stayed in the hallway with the bat until I saw police lights pull up outside. When the officers arrived, they searched my backyard with flashlights and found a black backpack lying on the ground near my fence, apparently dropped when the intruders heard me shouting that police were coming. They secured the backpack without opening it and called Detective Hayes, who arrived about 20 minutes later to take over the scene. Hayes put on gloves and opened the backpack right there in my kitchen while I watched. Inside, he found a pair of black gloves, a cheap lighter, several receipts from a hardware store dated from the past week, and a phone with a cracked screen. He powered on the phone and I saw his expression change as he scrolled through the screen. He turned it toward me and showed screenshots of a group chat with 4 participants discussing my house, my work schedule, and specific plans about finishing what we started. The messages referenced the fire attempt from before and talked about waiting until I was gone to avoid getting caught this time. One message specifically said they should check my garbage on trash day to learn my routine. Hayes bagged everything as evidence and told me this was exactly what he needed to file serious charges that would stick. He explained that the phone and the group chat screenshots gave them proof of conspiracy and planning, not just random harassment. He also said the receipts from the hardware store matched items typically used for arson, which strengthened the attempted arson charge they'd been building. I felt sick reading those messages, realizing how close I'd come to losing everything if they'd succeeded. Detective Hayes moved fast with the new evidence. Within 2 days, he had a search warrant for Jeremy's bedroom based on the backpack contents and the group chat screenshots. I wasn't there when they executed the warrant, but Hayes called me afterward to describe what they found. Jeremy had materials in his closet that matched the hardware store receipts from the backpack, including containers that could be used to transport accelerants. More damning was a spiral notebook tucked under his mattress with pages of notes about my daily routine, what time I left for work, what time I usually got home, and which nights my house appeared empty. There were even sketches of my property layout showing where the cameras were positioned and which areas had blind spots. Hayes said reading that notebook made him realize how obsessed Jeremy had become with planning another attempt. The level of detail showed this wasn't just teenage anger anymore, it was something darker and more calculated. I felt sick when Hayes read me some of the entries over the phone, knowing Jeremy had been watching my house so carefully for weeks. The district attorney's office filed a juvenile petition against Jeremy for attempted arson, criminal trespassing, and violation of the no-contact order. Franklin Mahoney and Reese Clements were notified by certified mail that their son was facing serious charges in juvenile court. Their lawyer contacted them immediately to explain that these weren't minor offenses that would disappear with a warning. The attempted arson charge alone carried potential detention time in a juvenile facility, and the violation of the no-contact order showed a pattern of escalating behavior. The lawyer also explained that they were facing potential civil liability for damages because Jeremy was still a minor living under their supervision. If I chose to file a civil lawsuit for all the harassment and damage, they could be held financially responsible beyond just the criminal restitution. Hayes told me later that this was the first time Jeremy's parents seemed to understand the full scope of what their son had done. The reality of serious legal consequences and potential financial ruin finally broke through their denial about Jeremy just being a normal kid making mistakes. The next 2 weeks turned into a blur of court appearances and meetings with prosecutors. I had to take time off work for an initial hearing where the judge reviewed the charges and set conditions for Jeremy's release pending trial. Then there was a meeting with the prosecutor's office where they walked me through the evidence and explained how juvenile court worked differently than adult criminal court. The system focused more on trying to help kids change their behavior through programs and supervision rather than just punishment. But the charges were serious enough that Jeremy faced real penalties if convicted. I had to go to another hearing where they discussed whether Jeremy should remain at home or be placed in temporary detention, and the judge decided home detention with an ankle monitor was appropriate given the severity of the charges. Each court appearance meant taking time off work, and Gabriella pulled me aside after I requested my 4th absence in 2 weeks. She asked if everything was okay because my performance had been slipping and I'd been distracted during meetings. I gave her a brief explanation about the ongoing legal situation, and she was sympathetic, but reminded me that I needed to find a way to balance this with my job responsibilities because the company had deadlines that couldn't keep being pushed back. About 3 weeks into the court process, the prosecutor called to tell me that Jeremy's lawyer had approached him about negotiating a plea agreement. They wanted to avoid going to trial because the evidence was strong, and a trial would be unpredictable for their side. The lawyer was offering to have Jeremy accept responsibility for all the charges in exchange for probation instead of detention time, 200 hours of community service, mandatory anger management counseling, and full restitution for all my documented damages. The prosecutor explained that this kind of plea deal was common in juvenile cases because the system preferred rehabilitation over punishment when possible. He asked for my input on whether I would support accepting the plea or if I wanted them to push forward with a trial. He reminded me that my opinion mattered, but ultimately the decision belonged to the district attorney's office since this was a criminal case, not a civil lawsuit. I spent that whole night lying awake thinking about whether a plea deal would be enough justice for everything Jeremy had put me through. Part of me wanted to see him face a trial and get the maximum consequences possible, but another part of me was exhausted from all the court appearances and just wanted this to be over. I called Detective Hayes the next morning to get his advice, and he was honest with me about the risks. He explained that trials were unpredictable, even with strong evidence, because you never knew how a judge might rule or what arguments the defense might make that could create reasonable doubt. A plea agreement guaranteed that Jeremy would face real consequences and be held accountable, while a trial might result in lesser findings or even acquittal on some charges if something went wrong. Hayes reminded me that the goal was to make sure Jeremy faced meaningful penalties and had supervision to prevent him from doing this again, not necessarily to get the harshest punishment possible. After thinking about it for another day, I decided that guaranteed accountability was better than risking Jeremy getting off with nothing because of some legal technicality or unexpected trial outcome. I called the prosecutor back and told him I would support the plea agreement as long as the probation terms were strict and the no-contact order remained in effect. The plea hearing happened on a cold morning in early December at the juvenile courthouse downtown. I sat in the gallery while Jeremy stood before the judge with his lawyer beside him and his parents sitting in the row behind him looking defeated. The judge asked Jeremy directly if he understood the charges and if he was pleading guilty of his own free will, and Jeremy had to answer yes to each question. Then the judge went through each charge one by one, asking Jeremy to admit what he had done. Jeremy had to say out loud that he violated the no-contact order, that he attempted to start a fire at my property, and that he trespassed on my property with intent to cause damage. His voice was quiet, and he kept his eyes down the whole time, but he admitted to everything. The judge accepted the plea and then announced the sentence terms. Jeremy would serve 18 months of probation with regular check-ins with a probation officer, complete 200 hours of community service at locations approved by the court, attend mandatory anger management counseling once a week for 6 months, and comply with a formalized no-contact order that would remain in effect through his entire probation period. The judge made it clear that any violation of these terms would result in immediate detention and additional charges. The judge also addressed the restitution portion of the sentence. Based on all my documented damages, including the destroyed Halloween decorations, the fire damage to my garage siding, the slashed tires, the cost of additional security equipment, and the food delivery harassment, the total came to $3,200. The judge ordered Jeremy to pay this amount in full through a payment schedule managed by the court. Jeremy would pay what he could from any money he earned, and his parents would be responsible for covering the rest since he was still a minor. The payment schedule was set up with monthly installments over the next 18 months, with the full amount due before his probation ended. It wasn't everything I'd lost when you factored in all the time off work, the emotional stress, and the items that couldn't be replaced, but it was more than I'd expected to actually recover through the court system. The judge made Franklin and Reese sign paperwork, acknowledging their responsibility for the payments, and I watched them both look older and more tired than they had at the beginning of this whole situation. After the hearing, I spent that weekend going through my garage and photographing everything I had left. I posted the animatronics and props on 3 different Halloween enthusiast forums and Facebook Marketplace, pricing them fairly but firm enough to actually recoup some money. The 12-foot Reaper was destroyed, but I still had a functioning fog machine, 2 smaller animatronics that hadn't been damaged, and about 15 handmade tombstones. Within a week, I sold the fog machine to a guy 2 towns over for $200, and a Halloween store owner bought both animatronics for $500 combined. Letting them go hurt more than I expected because I'd spent hours in my garage building each piece by hand, but I needed to be practical about finances. The tombstones went in smaller batches over the next few weeks, bringing in another $300 total. It wasn't enough to cover everything I'd lost, but combined with the insurance payout and the court-ordered restitution, I could at least stop bleeding money. Carol called me the Tuesday after the hearing to say she'd gotten commitments from 7 other families to join the neighborhood watch. We met at her house that weekend to set everything up, sitting around her kitchen table with coffee while we hammered out the details. We created a shared group chat and divided the evening hours into shifts, so someone was always keeping an eye on the street between 6 and midnight. 8 families total meant we each only had to patrol 1 evening per week, which felt manageable. Carol printed out a schedule and laminated copies for everyone. The first night we started the rotation, I saw at least 3 neighbors out walking their dogs or checking their mailboxes during my shift, and it made the whole street feel different. It wasn't the quiet neighborhood I'd hoped to live in when I moved here, but at least we were looking out for each other now. The first week after we started the watch, I slept through the entire night for the first time in months. I still woke up twice to check my phone and pull up the security camera feeds, but I fell back asleep both times instead of lying there with my heart pounding until dawn. As more weeks passed without any new incidents, my body started to relax in ways I didn't even realize had been tense. My shoulders didn't ache constantly anymore. I stopped jumping at every car door slamming outside. I still checked the cameras obsessively, probably 10 times a day, but the panic that used to come with it faded into just a habit. One morning I woke up and realized I'd been living in crisis mode for months, and my body was completely exhausted from it. Work got better too, as I could finally focus without constantly checking my phone for security alerts or dealing with emergencies. I stopped showing up late because of vandalism cleanup or court appearances. I met my project deadlines without extensions for the first time since Halloween. Gabriella pulled me aside in January after a team meeting and told me she was glad to see me getting back to normal, that she'd been worried about me for a while. During my annual review in late January, she mentioned my recent improved performance and gave me a small raise, 3%, which wasn't huge, but helped offset some of the financial damage from everything that happened. I thanked her and didn't mention that normal still felt pretty far away, but at least I was functional again. The letter from the juvenile probation office arrived on a Thursday in late January. I saw the official return address and knew what it was before I even opened it. Inside was a single page with Jeremy's name at the top and a court-ordered apology that was clearly written by his lawyer. The language was completely generic, talking about poor choices and learning from mistakes and accepting responsibility for actions. There was nothing in it that acknowledged the actual fear and violation he'd caused, nothing that felt like it came from him personally. It was just legal boilerplate designed to check a box on his probation requirements. I read it twice, looking for anything genuine, then filed it away in the folder with all the police reports and court documents. It didn't give me any satisfaction, but I hadn't really expected it to. I started planning next Halloween in early February, sketching ideas in a notebook during my lunch breaks. This time, I kept everything realistic and focused on safety. I'd keep all the decorations closer to the house where I could see them from my windows. I'd only use weather-resistant pieces that could be easily secured or brought inside each night. I'd install even better lighting around the perimeter so nothing was hidden in shadows. The joy of decorating wasn't completely dead inside me, but it was definitely tempered by hard lessons about security and realistic expectations. I wasn't going to recreate my original vision of an elaborate Halloween wonderland, but I could do something smaller and safer that wouldn't make me a target. One afternoon in February, I was driving home from the grocery store when I saw Jeremy picking up trash along the main road. He was wearing a bright orange safety vest and using one of those grabber tools to collect litter into a black garbage bag. A man in a county vehicle was parked about 50 feet away, watching him, and I recognized the supervisor as Albert Gomez from the probation paperwork. Jeremy looked up as I drove past, and our eyes met for just a second before I looked back at the road. Neither of us waved or nodded or acknowledged the other in any way. I felt this strange mix of vindication and emptiness, watching him do court-ordered labor in an orange vest, like I'd won something but it didn't feel as good as I thought it would. Albert Gomez called me a week later as part of his regular check-ins. He confirmed that Jeremy hadn't violated the no-contact order and asked if I'd noticed any suspicious activity around my property. I told him everything had been quiet since the plea hearing. He encouraged me to keep documenting anything that seemed off and reminded me that Jeremy's probation terms included regular searches of his room and strict curfews, so he was being actively monitored. Knowing that someone official was keeping tabs on the situation helped me feel less vulnerable, like I wasn't just relying on my cameras and the neighborhood watch to catch problems. By March, Albert called again to update me that Jeremy had completed about 50 hours of his community service, which was a quarter of the total requirement. He also mentioned that Jeremy's family had made 3 payments toward the restitution through the court system, about $200 each time. I didn't have any direct contact with Franklin or Reese, which was a relief because I had nothing to say to them anyway. The money showed up in my account through an automated court payment system. I put it straight into savings and started planning seriously for next Halloween, pricing out new decorations that would be harder to damage or steal. The community meeting happened on a Tuesday evening in March at the local library. The police department had organized it to talk about neighborhood safety after several families complained about ongoing teen harassment. I showed up early and found about 40 people already there, filling up the folding chairs in the community room. A police sergeant gave a presentation about recent trends and initiatives, and then they opened the floor for people to share their experiences. Carol spoke about the package thefts and vandalism. An older couple talked about their mailbox getting destroyed 3 times. A single mom described teenagers throwing rocks at her windows. Hearing all these stories made me realize the problem was way bigger than just my Halloween decorations. The police announced new initiatives for youth programs and increased patrols in problem areas. It felt good to see the problem being addressed at a community level, even if it had taken years to get to this point. Carol started calling me more often after that meeting, not just about neighborhood watch stuff, but to actually check in and see how I was doing. We grabbed coffee a few times in late March and talked about regular life things, not just the Jeremy situation, and it felt good to have a friend who understood what I'd been through. In early April, she invited me to a backyard barbecue at her place on a Saturday afternoon. I showed up with a bag of chips and found about 15 neighbors there, including several families who'd spoken up at the library meeting. People introduced themselves and shared their own stories about dealing with harassment on the block, and for the first time since moving into this house, I felt like I was part of something bigger than just my own problems. The weather started warming up in late April, and I found myself spending more time in my garage again. I pulled out my tools and sketches and started designing new Halloween props. But this time, I was thinking differently about everything. I built a 6-foot-tall skeleton that could be completely disassembled and stored inside within minutes. I designed a graveyard fence system with quick-release brackets, so the whole thing could be locked down or moved. Every piece I worked on had security built into the design from the start, making sure nothing was too heavy to move quickly or too delicate to survive being handled roughly. The creative process felt healing in a way I didn't expect, like I was taking back control of something that had been stolen from me. I spent hours in the garage measuring and cutting and painting, and my mind felt clearer than it had in months. In May, I got an official letter from the Juvenile Probation Office, letting me know that Jeremy had completed his court-ordered anger management program. The letter said his probation officer reported that he was maintaining good behavior and meeting all his requirements. Part of me wanted to feel satisfied that the system was working, and that maybe Jeremy was actually learning something from all this. But mostly I just felt cautious and kind of empty about the whole thing. I'd learned over the past year that doing what you're told because a court makes you is not the same as actually changing who you are inside. I filed the letter away with all the other paperwork and decided not to think too much about what Jeremy was or wasn't learning. By late summer, I started thinking about how to handle Halloween differently this year. I didn't want to hide inside my house or give up on decorating completely, but I also knew I couldn't just set everything up and hope for the best. I talked to Carol about organizing an open house event where neighbors could come see the setup before Halloween night. She loved the idea and offered to help me plan it. We spent a few evenings in September putting together invitations and a schedule. We decided to do it on the first Saturday in October from 2 to 5 in the afternoon. Carol helped me make a list of all the families on our neighborhood watch group, and we hand-delivered invitations to about 40 houses. The goal was to build connections with people and show them that my decorations were meant to bring joy to the community, not cause problems or drama. The open house turned out way better than I expected. About 30 neighbors stopped by throughout the afternoon, including families with little kids who were already excited about Halloween. The kids loved climbing on the props and asking questions about how everything worked. Parents told me they appreciated the effort, and several people offered to help me set up on Halloween night and keep an eye on things. One dad said he'd walk through every couple hours just to make sure everything stayed peaceful. A mom offered to bring her teenage son to help me move props inside at the end of the night. Standing in my yard surrounded by neighbors who actually cared about what I was doing made me feel supported in a way I never experienced during my first Halloween here. Halloween night finally came and I was nervous but determined to make it work. I had my scaled-down display running with all the security measures in place. Carol and 3 other neighbors took turns walking through my yard throughout the evening, chatting with trick-or-treaters and just being visible. My security cameras were recording everything, and my motion sensors were active. The evening went smoothly with hundreds of kids coming through in costumes. Parents thanked me for decorating and kids got excited about the animatronics. 0 incidents happened all night. No vandalism, no harassment, no problems at all. I actually enjoyed myself for the first time in a year, handing out candy and seeing kids smile at the decorations I'd worked so hard to create. The next morning, I woke up early and went through all my security footage from the night before. Every single clip showed happy kids in costumes, grateful parents, and neighbors keeping watch. Nothing but normal Halloween fun. Carol sent a text to the neighborhood watch group chat, saying everything stayed quiet on her end too. For the first time in a year, Halloween didn't end with me stressed out and angry and documenting damage. It felt like a genuine victory, even if it was smaller and simpler than my original dream of the elaborate display I'd planned. In November, the final restitution payment from Jeremy's family came through the court system. I logged into my account and saw the deposit, bringing the total to about $3,200 spread across multiple payments over the past months. The money didn't cover everything I'd lost when you factored in the time, the stress, the damaged pieces I couldn't replace, and all the security upgrades I'd had to buy. But it was enough to feel like some level of accountability had been achieved through the legal process. I transferred the money into my savings account and made a decision to stop dwelling on what happened and start moving forward with my life. Albert sent me a final notification in late November saying that Jeremy had completed all 200 hours of his community service requirement. The email said Jeremy would remain on probation for another 6 months, and the no-contact order would stay in effect through the end of his probation period in May. I read the update and sent back a brief acknowledgement, but I didn't let myself think too much about it. My focus was on my own life now, not on tracking every detail of Jeremy's consequences. I started planning next year's Halloween display with actual confidence instead of fear. I'd learned how to balance my creative ambitions with practical security measures. I had a supportive neighborhood network backing me up. The decorations would never be quite as elaborate as my original vision of the 12-foot Reaper and custom animatronics covering my entire yard. But they'd be sustainable and safe and something I could actually enjoy creating without constant worry about destruction. Carol texted me in mid-November, asking if I wanted to help organize a tool-sharing program through the Neighborhood Watch. She'd been talking to other families who mentioned needing to borrow lawn equipment or power tools, but not knowing who to ask. We set up a shared document where people could list what tools they had available to lend and what they might need to borrow. Within 2 weeks, 12 families signed up and people were actually using it. Someone borrowed my leaf blower. I borrowed a pressure washer from 3 houses down, and it felt good to have a reason to interact with neighbors beyond just security concerns. Carol also started planning monthly social events, just casual stuff like weekend cookouts or holiday potlucks where families could get to know each other better. The first one happened in early December, and about 20 people showed up. Kids played in someone's backyard while adults talked and shared food. Multiple neighbors mentioned that they'd noticed way less trouble with teenagers lately, not just from Jeremy's group, but from other kids who used to cause problems too. Our cameras and regular evening walks seemed to be working as a real deterrent. I sat down one weekend and wrote out clear rules for myself about future Halloween displays. Everything had to be either secured with locks and cables or light enough to bring inside quickly each night. I'd communicate my plans with neighbors at least 2 weeks in advance, so everyone knew what to expect and could offer input or concerns. I'd check in with the neighborhood watch group regularly during October to make sure everyone felt comfortable and safe. And I'd keep my security system active all year, not just during Halloween season, because prevention was better than dealing with damage after the fact. Writing these boundaries down made me feel more in control, like I had an actual plan instead of just hoping things would work out. I knew I could still enjoy decorating without making myself a target again. December came with cold weather and early darkness. I found myself thinking about everything that happened over the past year while I was putting up simple Christmas lights on my porch. My original dream of those huge, elaborate Halloween displays with custom animatronics covering my entire yard felt like it belonged to a different person now. I'd learned that security and community responsibility had to come first, even if it meant scaling back my creative ambitions. But I hadn't given up completely. I was just smarter now about what risks I could handle and what precautions I needed to take. I felt more connected to my neighbors than I ever expected to, and I actually knew people's names and had their phone numbers saved. I could handle problems better because I wasn't trying to deal with everything alone anymore. Jeremy's consequences still felt incomplete to me. Probation and community service didn't erase what he put me through or fully pay back what I lost, but I'd built something more sustainable than what I started with. Next Halloween would be better because I was prepared, I had support, and I understood the reality of living in this neighborhood. And that's the full rundown. I try to keep things short but meaningful, so hopefully this gave you a useful takeaway. Even one small shift in perspective can matter. Subscribe so you'll catch the next one.